All right, section 2 of chapter 11 is not a very big section. Essentially, it will only take a few minutes, whereas section 3 will take quite a bit more, and we'll try to cover both of those in today's lesson. So, section 2 is how do liberal democracies, Canada, United States, Western Europe, etc., balance the perceived common good, the collective good of the country as a whole or specific groups within that said country with the need to still respect individual rights. So, in your textbook, there's a case study about France from about 20 years ago. And as you can see here, it says France became a pioneer of Western democracy when it established itself as a liberal republic in the 18th century, following the French Revolution. Yeah, I don't like how that's written. France, yes, for a fleeting moment, they were a liberal republic, and then all hell broke loose with the uh, reign of terror and all that. I would argue that what they were trying to do in France was not sustainable because there wasn't enough security for that to occur. Although it is one of the oldest liberal democracies, the French government may sometimes act in ways that seem illiberal. Well, yes, when you take tens of thousands of individuals and have them summarily executed, that might be seen as illiberal. But they're using more modern examples from the textbook. For example, restriction on religious symbols. In the 1990s, the French government implemented laws which were discriminatory applied to the hijab for Muslims and the turbans, the Sikhs, yet yarmulkes and crosses were still allowed. Um, I mean, I'm not trying to be a mind reader, okay? Hijabs, and turbans, and what the Taliban makes their women wear are a lot more overarching as far as amount of clothing than say even what the cross would be or the yarmulke or something like that. Students wearing the hijab or turbans were expelled from schools. It'd be interesting to look at if that is still the case today. Sikhs and Muslims sued the French government but were reinstated to school, but the law remained. Belgium followed suit, and no visible symbols of philosophical, religious, political, or other opinions were to be worn by public servants when serving in public. Hijab are headscarves worn by Muslim women as an expression of modesty, as a symbol of faith, and sometimes as a sign of their commitment to Islamic movements or groups. According to some scholars, the hijab is mandatory, especially in the more fundamental sections of the Islamic religion. For example, the Taliban forced women to wear hijabs, forcing them out into public, and France forced women to remove it to force French Muslim women to stay at home. Now, the Taliban went a little bit further than just having them wear hijabs. They would have them wear this whole covering type outfit. In Canada, the wearing of religious headgear by Sikhs is protected by the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. If it was Passports Canada's policy to reject applications from Sikhs wearing religious head coverings was approved, would this mean that the government was limiting these Canadians' religious freedoms? Okay. I mean, obviously the one of the biggest examples or case studies of this was uh, the RCMP officer. I think it was Dagmeet Singh Dhillon from 30 years ago. He was from a Sikh background, wanted to become an RCMP officer, but because the turban wasn't part of the uniform, um, they were not going to allow him to be part of that. Eventually, it was ruled that he could, but this would be an example of that. He wanted to wear this outward show of his religion. The RCMP, to some extent, fought against that, but eventually he was able to win that decision. This is Viola Desmond. She was fined and charged for sitting in the lower section of a movie theater in Nova Scotia back, I believe, in the 1940s. Very similar to what happened to Rosa Parks in Alabama in the 1950s, where Rosa Parks refused to sit in the back of the bus. And the reason why this occurred is even at that time, they were still practicing segregation in various places in Canada. Eventually, the court, uh, she was exonerated for this, but at the time, she was charged for sitting in the uh, incorrect part of the theater. So, segregation is something that did occur in Canada. So there's other religious issues. Okay. As more and more Canadians or people come into Canada from different ethnicities, multiculturalism becomes even more of a factor. What does it mean to be a Canadian? Um, who makes those decisions? Okay. How far do we go in respecting religious freedoms? And like I said, there's links to uh, Canada, The Story of Us. This specific one comes from episode 10, 9 minutes in. Certain emergent issues. And I mean, I think if you're a critical thinker, I mean, you would obviously understand that, you know, all of us have different backgrounds, different perspectives on issues. Um, you can see that there's certain differences in so-called amount of coverings, for example. But anyways, I'll let you look into that. So other minority or other emergent issues that are in focus in chapter 11. Okay, gay and lesbian marriage, that has been more emergent in the last generation. Uh, Obviously, the aforementioned affirmative action uh, that has been uh, around in the United States since the 1960s. That I talked about a few chapters ago. Like I said, more information in your textbook that you can refer to. Okay. The whole idea behind affirmative action is essentially that because you are from a minority group that's been historically marginalized, that there are measures put in place by the government in order to offset that disparity. Okay. And so that's where this white person looks at this person uh, of a different ethnicity and says, "Why do you get a head start?" But if you look at the cartoon, you'll notice that his path is actually quite a bit shorter or at the same length as this individual's, and so he might seem or believe it's a head start, but in reality, they're just more on an equal playing field now. All right, so that's it for the second section. We're going to move on to the third section. And that third section is why do liberal democratic governments choose to reject the principles of liberalism in some cases? So you live in a democracy. Why do they reject it? Why do they say this cannot occur? And so this term illiberalism is going to come into play here real quick. Should liberal democracies always adhere to the principles of liberalism? Are governments ever justified to infringe or hold back on the rights of citizens? To what extent do democratic governments have the responsibility to adhere to the principles of liberalism during times of conflict? And what takes precedent? So, what's more important, individual rights and privacy, or ultimately collective security? And what you're going to see over and over and over again is that collective security is always going to take precedent over individual rights. It just seems like on every example, uh, the scales of justice seem to side with collective rights. This term that I have referred to from time to time, illiberal, refers to undemocratic, illiberal actions taken within a democratic or a liberal nation that go against your traditional liberal values and beliefs. So when you do something that is harmful or destructive or dictatorial in a dictatorship, that is not illiberal. Well, the only time that things can be illiberal is when you have this perception that you actually live in a democratic republic uh, type of democracy. These nations still claim to be liberal. Well, we're just doing it for the best interest of society as a whole, or this is a national emergency, or etc. Governments tend to cite two basic reasons why liberal values are restricted. One, public safety and a national crisis. Does this sound familiar? Okay. So, democracies do not always adhere to liberal principles. Once again, illiberalism. Okay, what are some examples of that? Well, here are a few case studies. One, you got the anti smoking movement. 20% of Canadians participate in a legal product and contribute to Revenue Canada because of the taxes. Okay. Um, Smokers over the last couple generations have been very harassed. Okay. And actually, some of them want to be recognized as a minority group with rights. Okay. All right. Another case study would be the stop loss in the US military. Okay. Now, what that was during the last war in Iraq, soldiers would sign up for their tour of duty. And then over time, the numbers of the soldiers that were over in Iraq, or basically in the US military in general, were starting to go down. And so I think it was George W. Bush and his presidency created this stop loss and said, okay, you have signed up, and I know your time is up, and it's time for you to go home, but we're going to force you to sign up for another tour. Okay, so essentially, some people that were told or thought that they were going to go home after a year or 2 years or whatever had to stay for an indefinite period of time. So obviously, being forced, it's kind of like a pseudo conscription. You're not being allowed to voluntarily quit. And then obviously the last measure is the War Measures Act, and we're going to get into that as far as specific detail here in a moment. But the War Measures Act is an act that was on our books from, I believe, World War One until the late 1980s, in which our government could take specific measures that were illiberal in nature in order to bring about security. Okay, things like uh, they could arrest you without a warrant, they could detain you indefinitely, they could check your communication. A lot of very illiberal type methods, but the reason they believe that they could do that, or they justified it, is that in times of danger, you need extra security type measures. And we're going to go into those three examples of when our country used the War Measures Act. Other examples in which your individual rights are infringed upon, the aforementioned smoking. Okay, you just can't smoke wherever you feel like it. The public says, you know what, you can't smoke in a building. Okay, if you want to smoke, you're going to smoke outside in a designated area. Okay, seatbelt laws. Seatbelt law came in, I believe, in 1987, and I didn't like it. It just infringed upon my cool factor. Okay, I wanted to put my hand or my arm out the window, and this bloody seatbelt was going across my shoulder. Didn't like it. Okay, but I got used to it. Certain gun control laws. People that own guns feel that it infringes upon their rights. Over the last few years now, you have distracted driving laws. Okay, you can't text and drive. Okay, but I mean, obviously, the public demands safety more than your individual right to text. The aforementioned stop loss that I already talked about. There was a movie actually made about stop loss about 10 years ago. All right, another theme here. 1984, 2 Minutes of Hate. When I watch some of the I wouldn't call them the protests, but the more riot parts of some of these events, I start seeing some of this come out. When logic and critical thinking are replaced by sophistry and emotion, then you get this. Um, Feel free to look at this clip at some point, but a lot of what I see from the novel and also the movie 1984 are starting to come into fruition in our world today. How mass media may manipulate. Another video I think that I would totally recommend that you watch is from an author, philosopher by the name of Noam Chomsky, and it's called The Five Filters of the Mass Media Machine. Once again, very indicative of what I'm seeing today from mainstream media, from corporations, etc. How we are uh, guided into a mindset. Okay, and I think I, you weren't in my class long enough to realize because some of my belief systems, but I'm very suspicious of a lot of things that I see on the news, and I always want to look at where does it come from, or why it would be portrayed, and whose interest is this helping, etc. Really have a look at this. And Noam Chomsky is actually a fairly left wing political thinker. Okay, so don't think that Levitt's all right wing or Levitt's all individualist based or something like that. But Noam Chomsky himself is more, I would say, on the left side of the political spectrum. All right, War Measures Act. That'll be interesting. I have no clue what that is there. Passed in 1914. Power concentrated in the executive, meaning the prime minister. It reduces all the checks and balances of going through the parliament would entail. Rule by decree. Okay, so you don't have to pass things through parliament. It's ruled by the executive branch, the prime minister, cabinet. Obviously, the rights of Canadians are limited. I have briefly mentioned what that is. Governments can take action such as detainment and arrest without cause. Uh, Bring in the military. Okay, during the October crisis of 1970, they brought in the military. Limits on the freedom of the press, etc. Now, in 1988, they actually replaced the War Measures Act because the War Measures Act actually worked outside of the Charter of Rights and Freedom. So they needed to bring something in that could fit within the Charter. And that was the Emergencies Act brought in 1988. So anyways, here's some case studies that talk about when they invoked the War Measures Act. The first time was World War One. Under the War Measures Act, immigrants from the Central Powers, so the enemy of Canada, the Central Power, nations already residing in Canada were considered enemy aliens. They were required to register with the authorities, to carry identification cards. They were limited on their mobility, etc. And some were actually put into internment camps. Okay. And some of these camps were located in southern Alberta, including in Lethbridge and also um, Banff, Jasper area, etc. The second time the War Measures Act was invoked was during World War II, and it was used to justify the internment and persecution of the Japanese Canadians. Once again, War Measures Act was invoked based on public fear. Of course, you know that the Japanese ultimately lost their land and property that was sold in order to pay for their internment. They were discouraged to go back to the West Coast after the war. In fact, many of them were encouraged to immigrate back to Japan. And as you know, many Japanese Canadians ended up settling in southern Alberta, particularly in our own area of Taber. The third time and the last time that the War Measures Act was invoked was actually October of 1917. Sorry, 1970. Where am I thinking? All right, so what was the pretext or what was the context or the background of the October crisis? There was the quiet revolution that was occurring in Quebec, where the Francophone majority wanted more and more control. More radical groups wanted independence, and even more radical groups wanted independence through any means possible. You had the people that wanted independence, the Parti Québécois, René Lévesque, etc. Um, and those movements kind of groundswelled towards independence for Quebec from the rest of Canada. But then you had the more radical, revolutionary, uh, you know, Marxist type groups that wanted to use any means possible in order to get their way, and that was the FLQ, the Front de Libération de Québec. Okay, they used violence to achieve and shed light on their goals. They were using terrorist tactics. They operated in cells. Okay, and so I'm not going to give you a blow by blow of what happened in October 1970, but ultimately it got to the point where the government of Quebec and the city of Montreal went to the government of Canada and said, this is getting out of control. We need you to stomp this out. And so that was the pretext or the reason why the October crisis occurred. Now, specifically, what happened throughout the 1960s, there were a series of bombings, kidnappings, armed robberies to achieve goals and notoriety. But things really started to crescendo in October of 1970. Here's a picture of Canadian soldiers probably in the streets of Montreal in October 1970. So on October 5th, the FLQ abduct British Trade Commissioner James Cross with ransom demands. A few days later, they kidnap the Quebec cabinet minister by the name of Pierre Laporte. Now, he was the second highest ranking official in the Quebec government, only behind the premier, Robert Bourassa. Like I said, eventually Canadian forces were sent to protect politicians in Ottawa because they didn't know how far this was spreading. Were they going to continue to kidnap? Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau eventually invokes the War Measures Act. There's a video clip that you should watch that will help you answer a couple questions in the Chapter 11 assignment. He's actually being grilled by reporters the day before he invokes the War Measures Act. But when the War Measures Act is invoked, civil liberties are suspended and the FLQ is formally banned. More than 500 people are arrested without warrants. One of the things that you can do in a dictatorship or under the War Measures Act is that you can just go in like a fish net and just start arresting people. And then once you've arrested them, then you can kind of maybe filter out those that are really dangerous, so to speak. Many Quebecois nationalists were arrested. Unfortunately, on October 17th, Pierre Laporte was murdered by the FLQ. Eventually, arrests were made. The crisis ends in December. James Cross is released in exchange for safe passage to Cuba for some of the FLQ kidnappers. So, interesting enough, the FLQ goes to Cuba because Cuba is a communist country. Obviously, the FLQ and communists have a bit of affinity towards each other. James Cross, was a middle-aged man at that time, back in October 1970. Guess what? As far as today, June 9th, 2020, he's still alive. The dude is really old. Unfortunately, Pierre Laporte was murdered by a different FLQ cell. All right, this was a number of sources that you had to look at the time, but please watch these video clips. Okay, they're very good video clips. Um, some are better than others, some are longer than others, etc. But this one right here was a source found on a diploma exam on a source interpretation. So these young men, young university students in the early 1970s, are getting people to write telegrams. It says telegrams protesting the War Measures Act to Prime Minister Trudeau and probably Manitoba Premier Ed Schreier. Please sign here. And basically, what this telegram says, we do not support the FLQ. Okay, let's not conflate that since we don't support the War Measures Act, that we support the FQ. No, it's not an either or kind of thing. We do oppose your suspension of your civil liberties. All right, so, anyways, this is the famous Pierre Trudeau "Just Watch Me" speech. The use of the War Measures Act to address the problems presented by the FAQ was well supported by Canadians in all regions of Canada. However, there were many vocal critics of the government action, including then NDP leader Tommy Douglas, who said, "The government, I submit, is using a sledgehammer to crack a peanut." While the War Measures Act was in force, 465 people were arrested and held without a charge. Critics accused Prime Minister Trudeau of trying to criminalize and break the separatist movement in Quebec. Okay, well, he was certainly trying to criminalize and break the terrorist separatist movement. But, once again, people like to conflate FLQ with PQ. And like I said, here's the link to that video clip when he's speaking to the reporters. Here's a couple quotes from that speech. "There are a lot of bleeding hearts around who just don't like to see people with helmets and guns. All I can say is go ahead and bleed. It is more important to keep law and order in society than to be worried about weak-kneed people. Society must take every means at its disposal to defend itself against the emergence of a parallel power which defies the elected power." I like that term, parallel power. It kind of signifies that there's a group out there that feels that they don't have to work along traditional government rules, regulations, etc., and they can rule by decree on their own. He was insinuating that the FLQ was acting as a pseudo parallel power. If you look at today in our own world, there are also examples of these so called parallel powers. Some people would call them the deep state. Some people might call them Antifa might be the arm of the so-called deep state. Some would say the KKK, etc. So, anyways, still very applicable today. And what you saw in the United States over the last few days, when they were bringing in the National Guard to try to quell some of these protests slash riots, um, some would argue, is the government overstepping their boundaries? Here in this picture is a picture of how many times did I say here or picture? Is Pierre Laporte found in the trunk of a vehicle. So Canada post 9/11 has also suppressed uh, its rights, its information. The governments have taken extraordinary steps in order to create more security. So once again, I talked about how the Emergency Act came in 1988, which replaced the War Measures Act. It differs from the aforementioned act in a few ways. One, A declaration of an emergency by the cabinet must be reviewed by Parliament, so the House of Commons and the Senate. Any temporary laws made under the Act are subject to the Charter. And there is a graduated level of control from level 1 to level 4, depending on the severity of the crisis. So it's not like 0 to 100, it's 0, 25, 50, 75, 100 kind of thing. So part 1, you have public welfare emergency. Part 2, you have public order emergency. Part 3, international emergency. And part 4, war emergency. Following September 11th, 2001, the Canadian government passed the ATA. That's not the Alberta Teachers Association, that's the Anti-Terrorism Act. It's passed in 2001, aimed at disabling and dismantling the activities of terrorist groups and those that support them. There's also a no-fly list. That's not saying that there's no flies in the airplane, but people that are not allowed to fly in airplanes. It is actually quite small compared to the US list. Lots of confusion and misidentifications, and lots of issues with racial profiling, um, specifically against people of Middle Eastern descent or background. Few examples here. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees civil liberties to our citizens, but there are challenges inherent in this document. These freedoms allow individuals to pursue beliefs that counter democratic ideals and may threaten the system itself. This reality justifies the security and emergencies legislation that the Government of Canada has at its disposal. Without this protection, our way of life would face continual danger from both internal and external threats. So, this phrase or this paragraph would say that the collective needs of society ultimately will outweigh individual rights. Here would be an example of um, them messing up on your name, and now you're on a no fly list. It's not that funny, so I'm going to turn to the next slide. All right. This would be an example where they would say that dictatorships or non-liberal entities will use democracy and the rule of law against the people that support those things. And so, if you live in a democracy, if you live in an area that believes in the rule of law, people that do not believe in those principles will use those rules against you in order to weaken you. And so that's what this cartoon is insinuating. Former Prime Minister Stephen Harper, it looks like for security reasons, he is limiting people's freedoms. All right, there was opposition to the ATA. It was opposed by the Muslim Lawyers Association of Toronto. It questioned whether the definition of terrorist activities would apply to a group that resisted by acts of violence the regimes of Saddam Hussein or the late Robert Mugabe. Well, Saddam Hussein's also late too. It also pointed out that it criminalized the French resistance in World War II and Nelson Mandela when he was against the apartheid movement of South Africa. Some of the bill's provisions expired in March 2007, while conservative government urged that these be renewed, while all three opposition parties were opposed. Specifically, the provisions had to do with preventative arrest and investigative hearings. On February 27, 2007, the House of Commons voted against renewing the provisions. It was eventually replaced by the Combating Terrorism Act of 2013 and the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2015. I guess in a nutshell, you need to understand that since 2001, our rights have been curtailed for the sake of security. In the United States, similarly, after 2001, freedoms were curtailed, specifically with the passage of the Patriot Act. Deter and punish terrorist acts in the United States and around the world, to enhance law enforcement's investigatory tools, and for other purposes. Once again, the Patriot Act limits on people's civil liberties and freedoms. Uh, Issues such as privacy versus security come into play. Ultimately, security trumps your privacy, and government agencies can bypass typical legal mechanisms to obtain information. So, if they want information about you, they can obtain it, okay, whether you agree to it or not. Once again, very similar to this. Right here, you have Stephen Harper basically blacking out the rights and freedoms of the charter. Now you have George W. Bush, President of the United States from 2001 to 2009, ripping up the Bill of Rights with the scissors called the Patriot Act. Here's another one. I think this is John Ashcroft, who was, I think, Secretary of Defense at the time, cutting up the Bill of Rights, or yeah, this would be the Constitution, because of the Patriot Act. A couple video clips about the Patriot Act, a couple of cartoons. That's Uncle Sam, the symbol of the United States, removing all uh, future aspects of civil liberties. And this was actually from another diploma exam source. The people are sitting there watching TV. They seem a little bit happy, but at the same time, they're being completely surveyed. And that is former VP Dick Cheney coming in and saying, now you're safe from terrorist attacks. But what is the cost of being completely safe? You're living in a virtual prison, being looked at 24/7. Not only looked at, but listened to. Another, I believe, attorney general at the time, looking into your private lives. Okay, so once again, the loss of freedom, the loss of anonymity, the loss of privacy for the sake of security. Many people are all right with that exchange. This was another source on a diploma exam. The aforementioned John Ashcroft, go home, leave the Bill of Rights alone. Dissent is patriotic. Well, it got to the point where any dissent could be seen as being unpatriotic. Few more case studies. Like I said, go ahead and look at these. Justin Trudeau. Um, yeah, you go ahead and watch those. Couple more case studies. I won't get into these, but where these individuals' rights were infringed upon them. The first one was Mahar Arar. Like I said, Canadian citizen born in Syria, came to Canada on a stopover in New York. He was returning to Canada from vacation in Tunisia. U.S. officials detained him, claiming he had links to the terrorist group Al Qaeda. Deported him to Syria, even though he was carrying a Canadian passport. When he returned to Canada more than a year later, said he had been tortured during his incarceration in Syria and accused American officials of sending him, knowing that they practice torture. There was an inquiry in 2006 indicated that he had indeed been innocent, and the Canadian government should have intervened. But really, the Canadian government at that time would just do whatever the United States told them to do. Another case study was Amar Khadr. This individual is probably a lot more controversial. Canadian, spent 9 years in Guantanamo Bay detention camps, charged with war crimes and providing support to terrorism after allegedly throwing a grenade that killed a U.S. soldier. He was 15 when he first went to Guantanamo Bay. The only Western citizen remaining in Guantanamo, Khadr is unique in that Canada has refused to seek extradition and repatriation. Now, that was a number of years ago, despite the urgings of Amnesty International, UNICEF, Canadian Bar Association, other prominent organizations. In 2009, it was revealed that the government had spent over $1.3 million to ensure Khadr remained in Guantanamo. And I probably should update that. Over the last number of years, he was actually released from Guantanamo Bay, came back to Canada, has been sponsored by the Canadian government. Eventually, there was a settlement that he was awarded, I believe, $10 million for his time in jail. Okay, and so when you compare the 1.3 million that the conservative government used to try to make sure that he was in Guantanamo with the $10 million that the liberals awarded him for a number of reasons. That's another issue for another day. But yes, that would be another example. All right, the George W. Bush administration in Iraq. Okay, the invasion in 2003 to spread liberal values, to get rid of Saddam Hussein. Okay, when the United States detained prisoners, they were not ensured their rights. They were mistreated. They were tortured, etc. Um, there's a movie that came out a number of years ago called Zero Dark 30. Very good movie, but it shows, some of these interrogation techniques that the Americans would use on their enemies. All right. The US referred to these people that they captured not as soldiers, but unlawful combatants. And so if you were an unlawful combatant, you were officially not a soldier. So that means that your treatment would not qualify under the so called Geneva Convention. Okay. So they could use some kind of different methods on you. Concentration of power in the executive to fight terrorism. So, for example, wiretaps, monitoring of specific groups, tracking emails, intermittent searches, etc. Here's a map of Guantanamo Bay. Guantanamo Bay is actually a U.S. held military base on the island of Cuba. Cuba, of course, is communist. The United States has held on to Guantanamo Bay now for 120 years. And ever since 2001, they have progressively built it up to house more prisoners. Here's some pictures of the isolation techniques that some of these prisoners had to undergo. 23 hours of the day, they were confined, but for an hour of the day, they were allowed some outside time. But even when they were outside, they were denied certainly some sensory stimuli. They weren't allowed to hear anything, they weren't allowed to see anything, they weren't allowed to smell anything. And as you can see, they're not allowed to touch anything. Here is the treatment of some prisoners the Americans had in Iraq. You'll notice the one on the right. That was a prisoner being held up and being made to look like a Christmas tree. This is one where American soldiers making this guy walk like a dog. All right. So, anyways, I'm almost done this slide presentation. A couple more political cartoons. This one is about privacy. Obama, or President Obama at the time, says, I've decided not to release those photos of prisoner abuse, so give Dick Cheney back his camera. So basically, he is blaming the previous administration on those events. This is Dick Cheney, vice president of the time, advocating waterboarding. Another political cartoon, it says, we would never pour water up someone's nose for 30 seconds to prevent 9/11 and save 3,000 lives. More clips about waterboarding as an advanced interrogation technique. Stress positions, sleep deprivations, examples of torture. We're almost done, people. And then finally, we talk about CCTV, individual privacy, liberty, and freedom, or collective security. This is an overarching question of Chapter 11. What is more important, the rights of the individual or the rights of the collective? And it seems like more and more the rights of the collective supersede the individual. All right. Well, some would argue you should not be worried if you have not done anything wrong. Okay. Problem with that, however, is that they can always find something that you have done, or they can always hold that against you whenever they want. I mean, you might say that, oh, I've never done anything wrong, but they can always make up things. Okay, they can always say that you've done stuff, that type of thing. So once you give up your freedom, an issue is, would you ever give it back? Like I said, that's a pretty good clip too. All right, I think we're done for today. Like I said, big question and activity is, are governments ever justified to infringe on the rights of citizens? Okay. To what extent do democratic governments have the responsibility to adhere to the principles of liberalism, even during times of conflict? And what takes precedence, individual rights or collective security? Well, it seems like collective security seems to trump individual rights. All right. Good to hear from you. Like I said, I'll probably make one or two more of these videos, and that'll be that. Take care, people.